Hello guys, once again welcome back to Swat Tuts. I hope you all doing well. In this video, I'm going to explain my process behind the latest person work, the Lego heads. I hope you all have seen the final render. If not, I've put the ArtStation link in the description. You can check that out. I'm going to do the complete breakdown in 3 parts here. In the first part, which is this video, I'll be explaining the Maya scene setup, which will cover the mesh instancing and dynamics to create the infinite number of Legos. I'll go through step-by-step process so that you can follow along and try to do it on your own. Then I'll be showing you the basic camera setups and other stuffs for setting up the scene. In the second part, I'll go through the texturing and shading, where I'll be explaining how I use a single shader in Arnold with 20 textures to create variation on the Lego face expressions. And finally, in the last video, I'll show you my lighting setup and render settings, which I used for the final lighting of the image. Before we get started, again, a humble request to the fellow viewers. If my channel was being useful to you and you think the content that I create is of value to you, please consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean a lot and encourage me to bring a lot more useful content to you. Also, share it with your friends who are also interested in learning lighting and look development in Arnold for Maya. So let's begin the first part. So this is our Maya scene file, which only currently have a single geometry, which is the Lego head, and I have currently assigned a Lambert material onto the geometry and added a single texture so that we can view the face which is facing towards the camera. So the first thing I'm going to do here is to create a mesh network. So for that, you can change the menu into the animation. By default, it will be in the modeling menu where the mesh menu won't be visible. So I'm changing the menu type to animation, and you can see the mesh menu here. And with selecting the head, I'm going to create a mesh network, and I'm going to use the geometry type as instancer, because if you create the mesh geometry as mesh, the file will be heavy and you may run out of memory. So it's better if you don't have anything to do with per instance. Here we are going to assign only a dynamics and do some falling animation so that we get the random positions of the geometry. So for that, you don't need to convert it to any mesh or create the geometry as mesh. So I'm going to choose geometry type as instancer and changing the network name to head. You can choose a name as you like. So I'm going to choose a name as head, and currently I have put the distribution type to linear, but you can change it later once you create the instancing geometry. So I'm just going to click apply and close. So it has created a mesh network which is called head and another instancer where we have this instance. If I go to the mesh here in the attribute editor, if you come to the distribute, you can see the mesh distribute node, and here the number of points defines how many instances are getting created, so you can adjust that. So the first thing I'm going to do here is to adjust the distribution type. I'm going to change the distribution type from linear to a grid. So now if you see here, you have a grid X, Y, and Z values, which will control how many instances are getting created on the X, Y, and Z axis. So you can adjust the distance between the grid rows and columns by adjusting the distance X, Y, and Z values. And then if you want to increase the number of grids on any of the axes, you can do that here. So I'm going to increase the grid X and Z a bit, and then I'm going to adjust the distance between them so that they are not getting overlapped or penetrating each other. And I'm adjusting the values to make it a bit closer to each other so that I don't have to cache it many frames to get a decent looking frame. So the next thing would be to go back to the main mesh node where I can add many more settings to create a random variation onto the instancing, because currently it's all facing the same direction and there is no variation. So I would want to create some variation on in terms of its position and rotation so that when it falls down, it will have some random values. So for that, first I'm going to create a random node. So by default, when I create a random node, you can see it has the position x, y, z and values to 1, which offsets each of the meshes instance geometry's position in x, y, and z coordinates. So if I put it back to 0, you can see it's all back to its normal position. So I'm going to change the x, y, and z position a bit, which is not really overlapping with each other. So you can see here some of the nodes create this overlapping, so you can do it after a limit. And now what I'm really interested in creating a rotations, because I can create a rotation Y up to 360, because what I'm interested in, I can have the heads to rotate in any direction, but what I'm really focused on here is that when I am doing the dynamics, I don't want the heads direction to change or flip to the backside where I'm just seeing a flat color on the Lego heads. I don't want to make it look like every Lego's face is facing towards the camera, but I would prefer around 80 to 90% of the Lego heads to face the camera, so that you know how much variation in the number of textures, or you know how much different the textures are. I would really like to show the viewers that there is hundreds of different textures which is added onto the Lego heads, or there are numerous variations in the Lego heads. So that's how you will usually see it in a shop, right? There will be different variations of textures on each Lego heads, and you can, just by looking at the box or wherever you're seeing this, you can see that there is like numerous variations in it. So I would want to have that feeling on my render. So for that, it's important for me to make the Lego heads texture facing towards the camera. And if I am rendering like this, you won't know how much variation the texture has because it's just a flat color. So for that, I can't rotate the heads in X and Z that much. I can rotate it 360 degree in the Y because it's just on the Y axis, which the heads gets rotated onto 180 degrees. That is totally fine because if you still see the heads, but here we don't want it to totally flip to the backside. So for that reason, I'm not keeping the rotation X and Z, not much. So that's the first thing. You have created the instancing, you have created a randomness onto the position. So I don't want to adjust the scale because all the Lego heads will be of the same size. So I would prefer to keep it that way. And the next thing would be to add animation, where I would make it fall onto the ground and create some more variation. So for that, I would add the dynamics node. And when we are adding a dynamics node, you can see we have created this locator here, which is a ground, which is by default get created with the bullet solver. Here on the outliner, you can see the dynamics node has created a bullet solver node. So here, if I disable this ground, it's completely gone. So what does this ground do? Let me show you by just playing the time slider so that you can see for yourself what the ground do. You can see as long as the Lego heads hits the ground, it started bouncing and sliding above the ground. It's not going beyond the ground to the bottom side. So currently it has Y value of -20. That is why it is below the grid. So let me put this back to 0 and put the slider back to 1. And let me again do a. So now you can see if I render this in, let's say, in the frame 39, you can render and get most of the Legos faces in clear. Only some of the Legos are flipped. So that was my intention when I was creating the randomness. I should retain most of the texture faces facing towards the camera. Let me explain some of the attributes in here on the bullet solver. The start frame will define on which frame the animation will start. Let's say if I put it on 50, so up to frame 50, it won't start any animation. It will start going down from the frame 50. So let me put it back to 1. Collision iterations are the number of iterations it takes between one frame to the other. So the more iterations you have, the more real the animation would be, the collision and all. So it will be colliding with each other also, right? So it is getting collided with each other and going down. So the collision would be more refined if I add more collision iterations. And the main thing we are focusing here is the gravity. So the value 9.8 is something that is matched to the real world. So you can also use some values which is lesser or higher, which will control the force in which it is falling down to the ground. So if you want it to fall real slow, you can use a lower value. And let's say if I put it into a positive value, you can guess what will happen. It starts floating. So let me adjust it back to minus 9.8 here. So if I go a value beyond minus 9.8, the fall will be faster because the gravitational pull is stronger here. So it comes down to what kind of animation you want, because in here we are not focused on animation. We need just a frame where it looks good. So I'm just keeping the gravity value as it is. So here we are adjusting only the y-axis. You can have x and z axis here where there will be gravitational pull towards that axis on the positive axis or the negative axis, so that when you animate the time slider, let's say I put the value y0 and added gravity to minus 9.8. So here this is the x value. So if I start here, it will go to the screen left side. So you can animate it as you like if you are planning for some animation. And now the ground. So we have already adjusted the position of the ground to match with the grid. The friction value is something which is the friction of the ground. So if I increase the friction, then the Legos won't be floating much as it is used to before. So if I put the friction to 0, it will be floating more. And if I put the friction back to 1, it will be, the resistance of the floor will be more and it won't float much. The bounciness of the floor is where you can see, like if we put a ball to the ground, it will bounce off, right? So it's the bounciness of the ground. It's not the bounciness of the object, but the ground. So if I add more bounciness, it will make the objects bounce more. It's not much visible here because we are really close to the ground. If you are changing the ground, move it a bit down, maybe you can see the bounce better. I think we'll have to adjust the bounciness of the objects as well. Since we are not really doing any bounces here, we can put that back to 0. Damping is also some kind of resistance with the objects. So if I put back that to also to 1, it will also increase the resistance and reduce the floating of the objects. So you can see it's still floating a lot here. That is because we also have another tab here where we can adjust all this friction and damping again. And this one works for the instance mesh. So if I add the friction and rolling friction to 1, let's see what happens here. You can see it is the friction between instancing objects. So it's not bouncing or sliding by colliding with the objects. It has that resistance increased. So let me put it the midway. And damping also is what we have just talked about. It also has increased the resistance between the objects. So if I increase the damping here, it will stay still. So this is not what we need, right? We need to have some variation in terms of its position. Here we are not getting that because of the increased damping and resistance. So let me just decrease it to a level which is more natural, and let's see what kind of results are we getting right now. So this is kind of natural. We are getting some good amount of resistance and good amount of animations here. So now, since it's just a tutorial and I'm just showing you the workflow of how you can create this kind of output, I'm not using a higher number of rows and columns here. But when I was doing this in my final render, I have pushed it to the maximum of my limit where I feel this is the scale I need, because if the Lego heads are really small, like really less in number, we tend to feel like the heads size in the real world are bigger. If we are thinking about photographing Lego heads in the real world, in a frame it's only around 20 or 30 Lego heads you are capturing, you tend to feel like the size is bigger. But if you, let's say you have hundreds in a frame, the scale seems to be smaller. You tend to feel like the scale is smaller. So if you want, you can go up to crazy amount of values, and I guess that will give you better results. So I'm just increasing the values to show you how much you can push it and how much that will give you good results. So this is kind of the numbers which I have used in my render. So again, for more randomness, I would like to rotate the heads a bit more so that I would get some more of the heads. Since it is very high in number, I would like to, let's say 30 to 40% of the heads to have textures flipped, so that it will create more variation and it will feel more natural. If in these kind of cases where there is like hundreds or thousands of Lego heads, if you see 90% of them facing towards the camera with its texture, it will feel a bit unnatural. So I'm increasing the randomness a lot more here, and let's try to decrease frictions as well, and let's see how it's going to look. So one of the other thing that I would like to look for is that I wouldn't want to see these gaps in between. So what I've done on my scene was that I put a ground there, and I've assigned the same color for the ground, which is matching to the Lego head color, so that the smaller gaps mostly will go in darkness. And even somehow it got lucky and some light passed through all of these Legos and lit up the ground, it will look like another Lego head which is flipped. And also we anyways going to use a ground so that it will block the lights from the bottom side, and it will only lit up the top side of the Lego heads. So that is also something that I would try. Let me again, I'm going to reduce the number of grids here so that my render or the simulation goes a bit faster, and I'm going to see if I can get some better numbers. So since this is very close to the ground now, it has some meshes which are already under the ground, so I would need to move it a bit up so that it will have some gap between the ground and the instancing geometry, so that it will have some space to create some variation in its fall and rotations. So to move the instancer up, I would go back to the main head node, and I'll add a transform node here. Yeah. So this is the transform node, and on the transform node, I'll change the position a bit higher on the y-axis. And now let's see how much variation it's going to give us. So you can see that gave us something better, because now there is really less penetrations and things. We can still see the gaps, but you know, that is the limitation of my laptop actually, which I'm not able to use bigger numbers. It's gonna slow down my explanation because I have to wait till the simulation is completed. So I don't want to do that right now. All I want to do here is to make you understand the process behind this, and for that the number of Lego heads feels more sufficient. And one other thing which I have used was the rotational strength. So what the rotational strength does is that it is the resistance of rotation when the collision and fall happens between the instancer geometry. So if I put the rotational strength to 100%, when it falls down and it collides with the objects, it will try to retain its original rotational value. Because we are keeping the heads to face towards the camera, it will always keep facing towards the camera even after colliding with another object, which is very unnatural in the real world, because when it hits some surface, it it tends to bounce back, and also it will change its rotations a bit. So you can also use the rotational strength if you see that more than 50-60% of the Lego words are flipping down and you're not able to see most of its textures. So in that case, you can use the rotational strength. So let me again show you what I mean by that. So here you can see most of them are keeping its rotation as it is. Even if they are falling down, it is not changing its rotations. It's just moving or sliding through above the other instances, but it's just keeping that rotation as it is. So this is how we are creating this kind of a huge number of Lego heads inside Maya using mesh instancing and dynamics. So one last thing that I forgot to, and just remembered seeing this initial state. So once you are in a satisfying position for your frame, you can click on this initial state button, and what it does is when you bring the slider back to frame 1, it will retain that position. So if you play from here now, it will start playing from this state. So if you go to the mesh editor, you can see this initial state. So if you want to remove this, you can right click and delete it, and it will go back to the initial position from which we have started, and you can then again redo the dynamics and find another position which is satisfying to you, and then again select the initial state. So when you go back, it will change that to its initial state. But I'm not understanding why this one is not maintaining its position in Y. I don't remember I had this issue when I did it in my final scene, because I was keeping it more closer to the surface. I think I didn't use the ground. I was just putting the position and rotational strength to the maximum and getting rid of some of the penetrations with each other, and I'm just keeping it on the same position without any rotation or sliding off. I'm just keeping it in the air and putting ground where it was positioned. So that's how I remember I did my render. But here I'm showing you another ways where you can do more proper ways you can do this. So now if I refresh this, let me check, it's not maintaining its position. So I'll see if I can find out it in a different tutorial, because without initial state also you can render. If you have found out that you have found a position which works for you, you can either keep the slider in the same position, just say frame 32 here. Also, you can go to the mesh utilities and bake instancer to objects, which will bake the instancer into meshes that will make the scene heavy, but you will have the meshes separately from the instancer so that you will have that position with you. And you can change the instancer again to see if you have better frames where you can see you have a better position, and again you can use that frame to again bake the mesh. So it's up to you whichever method or workflow that you want to use. And this is how you create instancing and dynamics in mesh. It's just a simple technique. I haven't gone too deep into the mesh system. It's just the way where you can create a scene like this. You can use your own creativity. You can use any other geometry. You can use toys, geometries, and create random toys. You can also add multiple geometries here. If you go to the instancer, it's just only head here. If you have multiple geometries, let's say, let me copy this tab first, and let's say you need to instance the plane as well. You can just click on the geometry and add it to the selection. And if you re-simulate it, it will have that selection as well. But here it's not, because when you add multiple geometries, you will need to create an ID node. And now you have the ID count too, and the plane is also getting instanced with the Lego heads here. So you can try that way as well. So let me just delete the plane from the instancer, which is messing up my scene, and also delete the ID, which is not needed here. Now, the second thing would be to setting up the camera. So it totally on you, like in what angle you would want to prefer to set up your camera. So usually I create a new camera and I would choose a focal length which is usually more than 35. In real world, if you are rendering these kind of Lego heads which are too tiny to photograph, you will use some telephoto lens or macro lens probably. So the focal length will definitely be above 85. So this is something that I always do. Like, I choose my focal length according to the subject I am rendering. So the basic thought behind this is that if the object is in real world and if you are about to photograph this thing, which focal length or what kind of lens you would be using. If you're not familiar with the concept of photography in the real world and you don't know anything about lenses and focal lengths, just search in Google like which focal length is better to photograph X or Y subjects. So you will get some suggestions from professional photographers or some websites that will have the insight for you to choose your focal length. Usually it would be any subjects which is not a landscape or environments, it will be above 35, and for landscapes and exterior environments it will be below 35, because below 35 is usually wide angle lenses which will cover a larger number of area inside the lens, and that's what we need in landscapes. We need to capture as much area as possible, where here we are zooming on to a particular area of the scene. So let me view it through my camera, and I'm going to turn on the resolution here. So in my render settings, I'm going to choose my resolution. So the resolution also is something really important. So usually our monitors, our phone screen, most of them right now are full HD. Either you can choose HD 540, which is 960 by 540, or HD 720, which is 1280 by 720, or another which is full HD is 1920 by 1080, which will be the common, because if you are rendering for your portfolio and all, it would be better at least you would render in a full HD format. You can go to 4K as well. So if you want to do 4K, what you want to see is that you should change the width to a 4K resolution, which will be 3840. So that is this value multiplied by 2. So when you change this, make sure you check this maintain width height ratio, so that when you change one aspect, the other aspect is also changed automatically. So here you can see you get a 1 pixel value extra here. It should be 2160. I don't know what calculation Maya does, which is totally goes wrong. It's just a simple maths, you multiply it by 2, but here it is multiplying it by some other value which is 0.200. I don't know. What I do usually is that either I just keep it unchecked and put the values manual. So in order to put your manual values, you should know which resolutions are we rendering. You should know the values. So let me go back to 1920 here, and it's not necessary that you always render in 1920. You can go a bit creative. You can choose a portrait also here, because since our simulation, what we have done, the planning was to do it a landscape. So this one will be a waste of all these Legos which we have simulated. So choose the framing that you want to render, and if you have planned it ahead of your work, when you're starting work, you can choose to do work according to your final frame, so that you don't waste any of your time creating all these unnecessary things which is not going to be inside your frame. So let me put it back to 1920 by 1080 again. And also sometimes I would prefer to change the height to lower values, so that I get more wider angle frames, which feels more cinematic. If you have noticed, most of the movies have this wider formats. The usual full HD format aspect ratio is 16:9, and the wider ratios will be, I guess, 20:9, which is some of the new mobile phones have, and the movies have 2.35:1 or 2:1, even more ultra wide formats. So you can experiment with all this and see how much beauty it brings into your frames. So that is all experimental. I would want you to test it out and see if it works for you. And most of the time, I am sure that you are going to fall in love with the more wider frames, because that is how it is. Even I do shoot some videos in the full HD format, and I just add black on top and bottom to make it look like it was shot on a wider lens. So experiment and try to be creative with all of that. So these are the basic setups that I do, and if you want to choose different frame, you can just move around looking through the camera and see if any of the other frames are working for you. So if you want to go close up, I would say choose one object which can be your subject, which will be in focus, and you can put any other subjects out of focus. So here I see that this one is facing a bit straight angle, so that I can make him more visible to the camera here. And even if I go a bit wider, I can still keep him facing towards camera. So if I keep the camera like he's facing towards the camera, any other objects are flipped or rotated to other directions, and it is the only one subject which is facing towards me or towards the viewer, so that the viewer's attention directly goes to that particular object. And even I'm framing it on the center of the camera, that is also something that you can do. And think about it, if this one is subject, if I'm adding depth of field or defocusing on the render, I'll focus on this one, and all the other persons, all the other instances here will be in out of focus, and that gives me a clear focus onto that guy. So choose the right angle which works for you, which helps you tell your story. So you can say what will be the story. So if I am adding 20 expression faces onto this Legos, I would choose one Legos face and I would see if it is smiling, why he is smiling. If it is sad, why he is sad. I can try to tell a story with that, and I can do my lighting, which will then again enhance that storytelling. So that way we have more of a storytelling frame with an amazing lighting, which again supports that story, and with all that other aspects which is working for you. And in the end, you will have your beautiful frame which covers all the aspects of composition, framing and lighting to make you tell a better story towards whoever is viewing your frame. So that is all what I would want to tell on this video. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you liked it. If you did, make sure you hit that like button. Please leave a comment as well so that I know what you think about it. Even if it is appreciation or suggestion, it's really valuable and encouraging to me. Share it with your friends who are also interested. And finally, please subscribe to my channel. I'll see you with the second part soon. Till then, this is Swats. See ya.